I first started CTVC 4 years ago as a newsletter tracking the climate tech space. And the rationale at the time for starting it was because it started to feel like there were hints of, we need to solve this broader climate crisis. At the time, it felt like there was a lot of sense of crisis, how do we get policy in place, but policy is slow moving and doesn't always address the solutions. And so I wanted to take more of a solutions or technology focused approach to climate. And at the time, it didn't really feel, that felt like a novel thing. Obviously there was clean tech and then a clean tech 1.0 where a lot of that fell out. But at the end of 2019, 2020, it felt like that was really starting to, there were whispers of that coming back in the form of climate tech. And so the newsletter initially, Climate Tech VC, was to track that at the start, to track venture capital, startups, who usually are the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, but the coal mine this time being a good thing. And so that was the newsletter. That was to track the deals, the companies, then using it almost as an excuse to interview investors and founders in the space. And then once we started gathering enough of those data points, qualitative and qualitative, we started doing a lot of these reports and sector deep dives ourselves. So we've published ones on long duration energy storage, green steel, the battery value chain, to sustainable seafood, and really tried to look at climate across a pretty broad lens beyond just energy. So that was the start of the newsletter. And then pretty soon after starting that, I went to an investment fund called Energy Impact Partners, where we worked really closely investing in early stage impactful energy technologies, but had really strong partnerships with utilities and industrial corporates that were typically, partners or purchasers of these solutions. And I think having spent time investing, but also understanding these corporates' perspectives, it became clear that in order to get to all these net zero goals, there's a gap in financing, which, having been an investor, that was somewhat addressing, but there really was a gap in information. I think it's easy oftentimes to look at the long-term forecasts and see all these charts going up and to the right. The clean energy, renewables mix becoming over time 100% of the overall energy mix. But then when you talk to the utilities, when you talk to the corporates, when you talk to even the technology providers, it just wasn't clear exactly what they should be doing in the here and now. And that was really the genesis of Sightline Climate, is how do we take this content and data that we've been building through CTVC, we now have 60,000 subscribers on the newsletter, and start to translate that into a tactical tool that can help now our clients, corporates, investors, governments understand how to play, how to participate in the broader climate transition in the here and now. It was definitely evolving. So when we started the newsletter, we were tracking deals that we saw happening in the space. It probably started off with EV charging, some battery stuff, maybe some solar stuff. And then over the last 4 or 5 years, that's been expanding, right? Now we have this whole sector called carbon removal that didn't exist 5-6 years ago. And so we started off thinking about, okay, what are the what's our mental model for climate tech? What is climate tech even? And so that came down to a few what we call climate tasks or impacts. That's monitoring. You have to understand how the climate is changing our planet. You have to understand how emissions look like in your supply chain. So that's kind of the monitoring vector. Then there's mitigation, obviously the lion's share, hopefully, of what we're trying to do here. Adaptation and removal. What do you do with the existing emissions already in our bathtub, or how do you adapt to it? And then we went down from there to 7 broad verticals, 5 of which are mostly in that mitigation camp, right? So energy, transportation, built environment, industrials, food and land use. Those are lion's share of the broader emissions pie that we want to decarbonize. Then there's carbon, which we think about in the context of carbon capture, carbon removal, or storage and sequestration, or even utilization, which fits in somewhat of that removal bucket, removing existing CO2 emissions. And then finally, what we call climate risk and intelligence, which is mostly that monitoring bucket. Things like, climate risk. How do you assess and understand changing risks in our planet, how that might impact real estate or commercial businesses? So that was our initial starting point. And then we started to go deeper and deeper. So now we look at 70 different sectors, so energy down to energy storage, And even below that, we're going deeper. So energy storage, long duration energy storage, mechanical, compressed air, because as we talked about, climate tech, it's a broader theme of many different industries, many different technologies. And at its most base level, that's where a lot of our clients we're working with start to get the most value. At EIP, we worked really closely with corporates and utilities, and I think that was the initial signal in my mind. They're still asking us questions. They're coming to EIP asking us questions, right? Like, we know how to do the first mile. We know how to do the 60 or 70% decarbonizing, right? You do solar, wind, storage. What about that remaining 20 or 30%? Is the kind of long-term solution going to be hydrogen or CCS? How do we think about what's actually happening on the ground? And the way I summarized it is no one knew what race to run. So that summer, last year, we did 100 different customer interviews. We spoke to investors, VCs, but also, later stage investors, project finance, infrastructure. We spoke to large corporates in energy, in industrials, in even food and agriculture. And then we spoke to banks and governments. And across the board, everyone feels the kind of urge, the motivation to decarbonize, to get to net zero. We can see the finish line at the 2050 or 2070 mark. But I think how do you actually get there within the next 5 to 10 years was a big open question. And there wasn't really a data provider, information provider to start tracking this from the ground up, to say, here are the technologies, here are the companies that are doing that, both the startups, but also the existing corporates and incumbents that might be playing in sectors like hydrogen or carbon capture. And then finally understanding how that's all commercializing. So, we've been talking about venture a lot in the newsletter, but really where the rubber hits the road is if these technologies start to turn into projects or facilities or plants. And so a lot of the work we're doing now with our clients is not just saying, you should be looking at hydrogen or you should be looking at direct air capture, but is this actually a race you should run? Are there things getting built where you, as a big utility or a big corporate, should be starting to pay attention? So if you think about, we're working with investors, we're working with large corporates as clients. At the end of the day, the investor, they'll make the investment decision whether or not they invest in the company, right? They'll build their own investment thesis. The corporate, they'll make their own strategic decision. Does this make sense for my business? So we don't go all the way to the end where it ends up as more of like a consulting advisory service, but we really try to help with that first or second mile. And the way we do that is could be summarized in 3 steps. First is organization. First is how do I understand, how do I map the market? And that's where the taxonomy comes into play, right? So it can be challenging, I think, if you're a corporate strategy and an innovation team, or if you're a ventures team standalone, to have the resources and the time to kind of map the entire landscape, all of these different value chains that need to play out. And so one of the first things we did was create the taxonomy, but also create this thing we called a sector compass, which is our version of a research report. Rather than writing a 50-page long static PDF that, a week from now is actually outdated, there's a new company and you're missing it, we've created a sector compass, which distills all of the key components of a research report. The context, what's the problem to solve? How does it work? What are the key questions and KPIs to be tracking in something like battery cycling, right? Like recovery rate is obviously very important, but also where you're getting your battery feedstock is also really important. So the kind of, here's what you need to know, and then there's the market framework. And I think that's the part that is actually quite challenging. How do you understand the value chain in that sector, or the framework for how to think about that sector? So for something like long duration energy storage, where does that solution set sit within the broader power generation and storage value chain? But really the framework there is on duration, the different 3 kind of quadrants, right? Short, intraday versus multi-day and seasonal. And so that's a lot of the initial work we do, is just how do you organize it? And then the second thing is who's doing it? Yeah. Who's actually doing or building these technologies? Who's developing these technologies? And so that's where we get into some of the market landscaping work. We've been tracking these companies, so we have a database, but it's also understanding what the startups and early stage companies are doing, but also what the corporates and incumbents are doing. They're going to have a huge role. They already have a huge role in playing across these different technologies. And then the third one is commercialization. It's understanding, how much of this is starting to, we think of it almost as a race to first. You don't want to be first, but you don't want to be last. But if you think about it almost like as a race, we started off here with solar. Now I'd say we're not at the finish line yet. Finish line will be, you maximize the potential output of solar, but we're starting to get to, 70%, 80%. Other technologies are still in that first 5 to 10%. But who is tracking how these different technologies are starting to inflect and deploy to get towards, where solar and wind might be today, even though they still have a ways to go. And so that's where we see Sightline headed, is how can we provide a line of sight to that overall kind of deployment, venture commitment to deployment, success rate. A good example is a large government energy entity in the US. They're a very active client and they use the platform through a variety of ways. I was at the DOE Deploy conference and was talking to one of the folks at the Loan Programs Office. And they're doing a lot of researching and mapping themselves, right? They're writing all these liftoff reports on different industries we're focused on, long duration energy storage. They wrote one on carbon capture, hydrogen. So they're focused on a lot of those inflection sort of technologies similar to we are. But for them, the challenge they have right now is they can write these reports, they can say these are the challenges, they can say, this is how much financing is coming in, but it's hard for them to understand how all of that is translating, how, Inflation Reduction Act and Loan Programs Office is actually translating into deployment and impact. And so what they've been trying to do is build dashboards to track some of those key metrics that they've been laying out in their liftoff reports. And what we can start to do now with them through the platform is, because we have that taxonomy, we can again drill down to the level of the technology. So we say something like long duration energy storage, how does funding split across these different technologies, but also what are different project deployments that are happening relative to some of the reports that they'd written. How can we track these KPIs for deployment and create a more real-time view that they can use to tie into their broader research efforts. So that was a clear example of, you can do a lot of this mapping, you can do a lot of this research, but actually being able to drill into what's happening on the ground, especially now that there's so much funding coming into this space, that's one area that they were really excited about. So my co-founder Mark likes to talk about it in layers of an onion, right? So the first layer of an onion is the pretty obvious stuff, the stuff that you can see or hear about. And so that starts with press releases, company websites. It's the outer layer, but you can't just stop at the outer layer, right? You don't want to just peel the outer layer of the onion. The second layer of the onion is where it gets a bit interesting, and that's going deeper into filings, permitting files, even town council meetings. We were looking at a project in Utah, and I think we were looking at a geothermal project in Utah, and looked through that town council's meetings, and they talked a lot about their project. So I think there's that layer of, it's publicly available, but you have to know where to look, and it depends on the sector, right? If you're doing something in the subsurface, or if you're doing something with utilities, there's disclosures that you have to do. So part of that is knowing where to look, and that's where my co-founder and a lot of our team's background comes into play. Sure. And then the inner layer of the onion, that's actually going and talking to companies, talking to the developers, the providers themselves. So we're fortunate in that we've built up some of that network, right? But it's hard to go to a company and say, hey, tell us about all of your projects. They're not going to want to do that. So what we can now do is, once we've built out that outer layer and the second layer, we have enough data to go and say, hey, we've built out this profile on the projects that you've built. Is this accurate? So we did do that actually with, we were building out a geothermal, early stage geothermal, enhanced, like EGS, enhanced geothermal systems, closed loop. And we tried to find as much data as we could, and then we went to a couple companies and showed them the profile, and they either said it's completely accurate or you missed this thing or that thing. Yeah. And over time you can scale that as well. So You can track individual projects, but I think what other research companies have done really well is anonymized surveys. So once you can do that at scale, once you can create that network at scale, rather than saying, okay, here's the individual price or cost for each project, which is really hard to get. How do you aggregate these different developers or providers and incentivize them, because they also don't know what the benchmark cost or price is. And you can do it in a more anonymized fashion. We're a team of people. We have research analysts. We're not a team of AIs yet, but we're a team of people. We have research analysts and associates. We also have a lot of engineers on our team. Our head of engineering, he was previously a machine learning engineer in bioinformatics. And so there's a lot of potential for what we could do there. Some kind of low-hanging fruit ways we're using it, at least gathering and sucking in a lot of this publicly available information. GPT is actually really good at that. And now that there's a web browsing version, it's not just hallucinating, it's actually, you still need to check it, you still need to verify, which is what we do, but instead of handwriting everything or, writing these descriptions and finding locations and getting websites, which has historically been very manual. People outsource it to like India and these other countries. You can do that now with GPT. And it can web browse, it can ensure and look up stuff for you. So at least that outer layer of the onion is somewhat easier to do. Yeah. Now that second layer of the onion, how do you actually go and dig into filings? And some of these are images, they're not even like text, right? That's a bit harder. Who knows, there might be AI solutions who can do that in the future as well. My co-founder, Mark, he used to work at a company called Kairos, which is a satellite intelligence startup. And his role there was to figure out how do we use this incredible satellite intelligence technology to understand the impact on the energy transition. So they'll do things like methane monitoring, but one of his products he worked on was monitoring the development of solar projects. And so hedge funds would buy that because they're trading on that. Is this project actually getting built out or not? Is it stalled? Why is it stalled? And you can see that all from space in real time. So this is not going to be a tomorrow thing. It could be a future thing. But I think starting to actually go that deeper level and be able to physically see whether or not a project's happening. We like to say, an artist rendering can only get you so far. If you have an image of a product or a project, that goes a lot further than just a drawing or artist rendering. We're working with about 25 clients across investors, corporates, and governments. We just launched Sightline Climate publicly last month, barely a month ago, like 3 weeks ago. So a lot of this last year was just getting the base level infrastructure set up, getting the team set up. I think we have a really clear direction in this next year, which is going to be fully focused on that concept of commercialization, that concept of race to first. So now that we've built our content and data and network on that earlier stage investment and landscaping lens, how do we be the first ourselves to track how those different technologies, how these different companies are translating into commercial deployments? And that's kind of broadly where we see the climate transition and climate tech being right now, as well as 4 years ago, there was barely any venture capital pouring in. Now there was venture capital pouring in, there still is venture capital pouring in, but it's scaling up these technologies, trying to hit those 20, 30, 50 goals where there's new deployments that need to happen in order to get there. So that's where we really want to be, is right in that shift and tracking that. I think I've always been really passionate about the climate space, obviously because there's a looming climate crisis, but I think this space in particular, there's such a large, exciting problem to solve, and I like taking a very solutions-forward approach. And it does feel like there's solutions here, right? Not all is lost. There's a lot of technological solutions, financing solutions, information solutions, which is kind of what we're building. And I think that in of itself gives me a lot of energy, where there's a big problem to solve. It unites our entire planet, our entire world. It's not specific to one community or country. We're all kind of living on this thing together. And there's a whole ecosystem of different levers to pull here. So I think it's really exciting that Sightline Climate, the company we're building, gets to almost sit on top of a lot of that rather than, I think it's great founders who are building specific point solutions and specific, hardware, but I feel really fortunate that we get to kind of look across all of that, almost like, somewhat what an investor does and still be able to build and operate a product and a team. And so I think that's what gives me energy, is feeling like there's progress, we're moving forward against this larger looming problem. I think some of the challenges within all this, especially going from an investor to a founder, you would think it'd be easy. You think you've seen the other side of it. You kind of look through the window and you're like, oh, I can do that too. And then you actually sit in the seat and there's all these miniature ups and downs and sometimes pretty volatile ups and downs. We put all of our money in SVB and then the whole thing crashed, and then we have 2 offices in New York and London and WeWork, and now the whole thing crashed. So so there's all these little things you don't think about, but at the end of the day, I think having that North Star for what you're solving for, having really amazing people that you can do that with who are way smarter than you and take the risk to work with you is what gives me a lot of energy.